The first time Einar held an axe, it wasn't to chop wood. It was to decide who he would become. That morning, the cold wasn't what burned his skin. It was the awareness that winter was not just outside the monastery. Had entered it. Snow from the previous night still covered the courtyard. White, silent, misleading. Under that pure layer, there was frozen earth. It lasts, relentless, just like him. The axe was leaning against the side of the well, partially covered by thin ice. It wasn't ornate. It wasn't special. It was a work tool, single cable, worn blade. But that morning, it felt different. It didn't look like an object. It looked like an invitation. Einar stopped a few steps away. He wasn't breathing heavily. I didn't shake. But something inside him hesitated. Until then, he had planned, observed, calculated. It was becoming inevitable. Yes, but inevitability without force is just intention. The wind crossed the courtyard, lifting loose flakes of snow. The sound echoed off the rock's ancient parts of the monastery. Inside the main hall, the survivors were still sleeping. Torvald was already on his feet, watching silently from the entrance. He didn't say anything because he knew. There are moments in a man's life when no words should interfere. Einar took the first step. Snow sank beneath his boot. Second step. Closer. The axe seemed bigger now. He slowly knelt before him, not as a warrior, like someone faced with something that could change their destiny. His fingers touched the wooden handle, cold, hard, real. His heart didn't speed up, but his mind opened. Images, fire-devouring Hrafnvik, the smell of burning wood, the sound of collapse, the silence afterwards. His hand tightened on the handle, not out of anger, out of fear. Because at that moment, he understood something disturbing. The axe wouldn't just be used to protect him. It would serve to transform him, and transformation requires loss. He closed his eyes for a second. He felt the weight of the object against his palm, the same palm marked by the cut that had symbolized acceptance of his lineage. Tool, arm, extension. He could continue to be the strategist who observes. Or I could accept that surviving would require more than plans. It would require impact. If he lifted that axe, there would be no return to innocence. Childhood had already been burned. But the last hesitation still breathed within him. Behind, Torvald took a single step forward, didn't interfere, just approached the enough to be present. Einar opened his eyes. The world seemed clearer, the least relevant cold, the heaviest silence. If he picked up the axe, it wouldn't be for chopping wood. It would be to start sculpting something within yourself. He adjusted his fingers on the handle. He took a breath, and he lifted the axe a few inches off the ground. The weight was surprising. It wasn't overwhelming, but he was honest, real, irreversible. He didn't lift it all the way, not yet. It stayed there, suspended. Enter the boy who lost everything, and the man who could become something even the veiled would have to fear. The wind stopped. The world seemed to wait, and in that microscopic space between decision and action, Einar felt something new. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was latent power. And that scared him more than any enemy. If he raised the axe completely, who would he stop being? And when the first blow finally came, would it be against wood or against fear? In the next block, you will see the exact moment when the axe stops being an object and becomes extension. But before, if you were in his shoes, Would you raise the axe or try to continue just planning? Comment below. Which is more dangerous, anger or the power that comes from control? And what do you think Einar will feel when the first blow hits? The axe was still hovering in the air when Einar noticed something uncomfortable. He was expecting to feel hate, but what came was silence. Not the silence of the snow-covered courtyard, not the silence of the sleeping monastery. An internal silence, as if something inside him was watching, evaluating. He raised the axe fully. The weight shifted his balance slightly, his shoulders adjusted, the fingers tightened more firmly. It wasn't too heavy, but it required intention. Every muscle in the arm needed to agree with the movement. Thorvald remained motionless, leaning against the cold stone of the archway. The eyes of the old warrior, they weren't on the axe. They were on Einar's face. Because the real danger is never in the blade, it's in the change it causes. Einar turned the handle slowly, feeling the rough texture of the wood against his skin. It wasn't familiar, it wasn't comfortable, it was gross, like the world that awaited him. He walked over to a log partially buried in the snow, ancient wood used for split firewood. He positioned himself in front of him, feet apart. Controlled breathing. He had watched men training before. I knew the stance, I knew the movement. But knowing is not the month what to do. The axe went up. For a moment, his arms hesitated, not out of weakness, but because his body understood something that his mind was still processing. From that blow, there would be no return. He brought the blade down. The impact was clumsy. The blade scraped before it actually sank in, producing a dry, imperfect sound. The vibration traveled up his arms to his shoulders. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't strong, but it was real. The wood didn't split, just scored. Einar stood still. The sound still echoed inside him. Something responded, not externally, internally, a spark, not violence, of capacity. He could learn this. He could master it. He could live with this. The thought hit him harder than the impact of the axe, because surviving meant being willing to hurt. He pulled the axe back. The blade came out with resistance. His fingers were already firm now. Second blow. More accurate, more determined. The blade sank a little deeper into the wood, still imperfect, but better. Thorvald finally spoke, his voice low, almost melting into the wind. "Don't fight the axe." Einar didn't respond, because he wasn't fighting the axe. He was fighting the part of himself that was afraid he might like it. Third strike. The vibration no longer surprised him. His body began to adjust rhythm and strength. Breathing found a pattern. He felt warmth rising up his arms despite the cold. The snow around the trunk was beginning to mix with wood chips. The wood gave way. A fissure opened, small but definitive, and in that instant, he felt it again. That distant presence in the forest, observing, always watching. The Veiled wanted to see if he would break, but what they were witnessing was something else. Not a desperate boy, but someone learning to become necessary. Einar lowered the axe. He looked at the crack in the trunk. He felt no triumph. He felt responsibility. Because if a simple piece of wood could be split with practice, men could too. And this realization brought a different cold, deeper than winter. He looked up at the dark line of forest beyond the wall. "You see?" he muttered to himself, not as a challenge, as a confirmation. The axe no longer felt strange in his hands. It wasn't yet an extension, but it was no longer a tool. And if he continued, what else would it be? In the next block, something fails, something hurts, and Einar will realize that the greatest enemy is not in the forest, it's inside him. But before, do you believe someone can learn to fight without losing part of themselves? Or does every warrior need to sacrifice something invisible first? And when fear begins to subside, is that evolution or the beginning of coldness? The fourth blow came faster than it should have. Einar didn't think. The axe just came down. The blade dug too deep into the already cracked wood and got stuck. He pulled. Nothing. He pulled harder. The trunk shook, but the axe did not give way. Frustration. Small, silent, growing up. He repositioned his feet on the crushed snow and pulled again, this time turning the handle. The blade suddenly came loose. Get out of control. The weight shifted his arm backward, and the tip of the axe grazed the back of his own body, hand before falling into the snow. It wasn't a deep cut, but it was enough. A red line appeared over the cold skin. The contrast with the white snow was brutal. He remained motionless. The wind blew again, stronger now, stirring up icy particles around them. Torvald did not run. He didn't speak, just watched, because there was something more important going on than a flesh wound. Einar looked at the blood. Don't panic, not in pain, but with recognition. Hrafnvik came back to his mind, not as an uncontrolled flame, but as a memory organized. He saw the fire again, but this time he felt no paralysis, felt focus. His mistake was not physical, it was emotional. He wanted to speed up. I wanted to prove something, maybe for Torvald, maybe for the survivors, perhaps to the invisible eyes in the forest. But the axe does not respond to haste, responds to intent. He wiped the blood on his own tunic without looking away from the wood in front of him. The fissure was bigger now. The trunk was giving way, just like him. Einar took a deep breath. He did not raise the axe immediately. He knelt in front of the trunk. He touched the crack with his fingers. The wood had held up, but not by force. For consistency, blow after blow, no hesitation, no rush. He understood. He wasn't training against wood. I was training against impulsiveness, against the desire to prove something before it is ready, against the fear of appearing weak. He stood up slowly. He picked up the axe again. The slight pain in his hand served as a reminder. Control. The next blow was slower, more aware. The blade descended with precise alignment. Dry sound, deep. The fissure opened wider, no uncontrolled vibrations, no rush. He repeated, and R repeated. Every movement now had rhythm, breathing, intention. The trunk finally broke into two halves that fell into the snow with definitive weight. The sound echoed throughout the courtyard. It wasn't explosive, it was conclusive. Einar remained standing before the two separated parties. His chest rose and fell slowly. The axe hung at his side. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. But something had changed. The wood was split, and so does he. The part that sought approval was quieter. The part that sought efficiency was more present. He looked up again at the forest beyond the wall. If they were watching, now they had seen discipline. But along with discipline, something else began to emerge. It wasn't anger, it wasn't revenge, it was taste, a dangerous satisfaction in the sound of a well-executed impact. And that disturbed him, because if the axe could shape his strength, it could also shape your heart. Torvald finally approached, standing by her side. "You have learned something," said the old warrior. Einar nodded. "It's not about strength," he replied. "It's about decision." But as he said this, a question echoed deeper. If he continued on this path, would you be becoming a stronger strategist or something colder? In the next block, the survivors will see what happened, and their look will change. But the question is, when others start to see you as a leader, do you still choose who you want to be? Or does it start to become what they expect? And you believe that discipline protects against darkness? Or do you just organize it better? The sound of wood splitting didn't just stay in the courtyard. He entered the hall, and something changed. One by one, the survivors began to walk out into the morning cold. They didn't come for curiosity. They came because that sound didn't seem like ordinary work. It felt like a decision. Einar was still in front of the two halves of the trunk when he noticed the looks. He didn't turn around immediately, felt it first, the change in the air, the expectation. When he finally looked up, he saw something different in their eyes. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just respect. It was a search. They were looking for direction. The crack in the wood now also existed between who he was and who he would need to become. Torvald stayed a few steps behind, paying attention, observing not the group, but Einar, because leadership is not born the moment someone speaks. It is born at the moment when others are silent. One of the older men, still marked by fresh scars from his escape, looked for the axe in Einar's hands. "Shall we train?" he asked, voice low, almost insecure. It wasn't a challenge. It was requested. Einar felt the invisible weight of that question. Training meant admitting that the monastery was not just a shelter. It was preparation. He could tell it was still early. I could tell they needed to rest. But rest wouldn't stop the veiled. Einar drove the axe into the split wood, not as a display, as a fixed point. "Yes," he replied. A single word, no speech, no grandiose promise, but something about the way he said it made some people's shoulders square up. He walked to the center of the courtyard. The snow was already marked by his own footsteps. He drew a line on the frozen ground with his foot. "Posture," he said simply. He showed it with his body. Feet apart, knees slightly bent, firm spine. He repeated the movement he had learned minutes before. Slow, deliberate, didn't explain too much. It demonstrated. Men tried to imitate. Clumsy, insecure. Some held axes as if they were dead weights. Others tightened too much, leaving their arms stiff. Einar circulated among them, corrected with brief touches, adjusted feet, aligned shoulders. His voice remained controlled. But something new was growing inside him. They were responding, not the shouting, not imposition, but for clarity. One of the younger ones made a mistake and almost lost his balance. Einar caught his arm before he fell. The contact was firm, necessary. "Control before force," he said. The young man nodded, eyes filled with something Einar recognized, trust, and that's when something dangerous emerged, not in the group. In it, a subtle sensation of influence, of power over the rhythm of the courtyard, about their focus, about their fear. He liked it, and that made him clench his jaw for a second. Because leadership can protect, but it can also dominate. An older man tried to compensate for lack of technique with brute strength. The blow was strong too much, out of control. The blade ricocheted dangerously. Einar reacted quickly, pushing the man back before the blade came back at him. Immediate silence. The mistake could have cost blood. Einar held the man's gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and in that second, there was hardness. He didn't scream, but the look said, "Weakness is not an option." Torvald noticed the rigidity, the growing demand, the risk, because there's a line between forming survivors and starting to mold them into tools. Einar took a step back, breathed. He loosened his shoulders. "Again," he just said. The training continued, more coordinated, more attentive, but something had been revealed. They were changing, and he was at the forefront of this change. The question was no longer whether he could lead. That's how far it would go. In the next block, night will fall. Einar will train alone, no eyes, no approval, no witnesses. And you will discover something even more disturbing. But now answer, when you start to enjoy having influence, how do you know you're still doing this for people and not for yourself? And leadership is born from pain or from the need for control. Night fell without announcement. The training ended before sunset, but fatigue did not bring rest for Einar. It brought restlessness. The hall was warmed by the fire. Low voices filled the space with a rare kind of hope. Small, fragile, but real. They had trained. They had moved together. That changed something. But Einar didn't stay. He went out into the courtyard again when the sky was dark and the cold had hardened his skin. Snow under your feet. He took the axe with him, this time not as a symbol, as a necessity. The moon reflected off the blade, creating a pale glow. He positioned a new log in the center of the courtyard. There were no eyes now, no survivors, no expectations, just him, and the distant sound of the wind passing through the stone walls. He closed his eyes for a moment. He felt the weight of the day in his arms. He also felt something more difficult to admit. He wanted to get it right. I wanted to hear the clean sound of perfect impact, not for survival, not because of strategy, but for the sensation. This bothered him. He raised the axe, came down. The blow was firm, not perfect, but controlled. He pulled the blade back, breathed again. The rhythm began to emerge without conscious effort. Impact, return, adjust, impact. Hrafnvik's memories came again, but they didn't knock him down. They didn't make him hesitate. They came as fuel. Each blow seemed to respond to something ancient within him. Each impact erased a fragment of paralysis. He turned his torso slightly, changed the angle. He brought the blade down diagonally. Dry sound, cleaner, better. The wind picked up. He didn't feel it. The cold bit his fingers. He didn't back down. His arms were starting to burn, but there was something different now. Physical pain was not the enemy, it was proof. He accelerated, not in a hurry, by test. He wanted to know how far he could go before the control broke. One more blow, deeper, more accurate. The trunk partially gave way. He took a step back, adjusted his posture, and, with even breathing, brought the blade down one step. Last time. The sound was different, not just impact. It was complete division. The wood split with almost surgical cleanliness. The two halves fell symmetrically into the snow. Silence. Einar remained motionless, the axe still raised, chest rising slowly. He looked at the two separated parts. There was no disorder. There were no scattered splinters. It was necessary, controlled, and for the first time, he felt something clear. Satisfaction, non-explosive, Not wild, deep, dangerous. He lowered the axe slowly. He ran his thumb over the cold blade. If it continued like this, he just wouldn't be able to. It would be efficient. And efficiency in war leaves no room for hesitation. The question came up without him wanting it. If the axe started to respond as part of him, what would happen to the parts that still feel? He imagined a real confrontation. Not wood, I don't train. A man before him. Breathing, making mistakes, fearing. Could he maintain this precision? And if you could, what would that do to him later? The wind blew harder, as if trying to tear the thought from his mind. But he couldn't, because the truth was already there. He was no longer afraid of the axe. I was afraid to like the clarity he brought, and this was harder to control than any blade. Inside the hall, Torvald watched through the crack in the door. Didn't interfere, but he saw the exact moment when the boy stopped training out of necessity, and he started training by choice. In the next block, something changes beyond the walls. The Veiled receive news, and what they decide will mean that the next training session will not be against wood, but against meat. Now answer, do you believe there is a point at which discipline turns into coldness, and when someone starts to enjoy their own efficiency? Is this evolution, or the beginning of the loss of humanity? The wind changed before dawn, not in the courtyard, in the direction of destiny. Einar woke up before the others, as if something had called his name. The axe he was next to his makeshift bed, propped against the cold stone. He took it without hesitation, didn't test the weight. I already knew. He went out, into the still dark courtyard. The snow from the previous night had hardened, creating a firm surface under your steps. He did not position any trunk. I wouldn't train. He just stood there holding the axe in front of him. Silence, breathing, conscience. He understood something he hadn't understood the day before. The Machado was not a weapon. It was choice. With each blow, he would choose who he would be next. With each decision, something inside him would grow stronger, and another thing, maybe it would disappear. Torvald appeared at the entrance to the hall, watching. "You have decided," the old man said. It wasn't a question. Einar nodded slightly. "I can't expect them to become strong if I'm still deciding who I am." Torvald studied her face. He didn't see anger. He didn't see impulsiveness, saw clarity. But he also saw the risk, because clarity can become hardness, and hardness can drive away. Before any other words were spoken, a sound cut through the morning air, not from inside the monastery, from outside. A short whistle, distant, controlled. Einar did not turn around abruptly. He just tilted his head slightly, recognized, signal. Someone beyond the walls was making their presence felt. It wasn't an attack. It was a warning or provocation. Torvald was already armed, but Einar raised his hand, preventing rash movement. He walked to the gate. Every firm step, no rush, no exhibitionism. He stopped in front of the heavy wood. It didn't open. He just rested the axe against his shoulder. "They want to see if we are ready," he said. Torvald frowned. "Are we?" Einar didn't respond immediately. He looked at the blade, to the marked hand itself, to the snow that was beginning to fall again, slow, steady. Then he replied, "We are becoming." On the other side of the walls, a knight watched silently. The message it would carry would not be simple. The boy didn't just train. He led, and worse, he was learning fast. In a distant room, far beyond the frozen forests, men gathered around a stone table. They would listen to the story with increasing attention. The Hrafnvik survivor was not broken. It was consolidating, and consolidation requires disruption. The knight turned his horse and rode away. Inside the monastery, Einar finally opened the gate just enough to face the forest. There was no one visible, but he knew. The next sound that would cut through the air would not be warning, it would be steel. He closed the gate. He turned to the courtyard. For the men who were beginning to leave, trusting in his direction, he raised the axe before them, not as a threat, as a symbol. "Training is over," he said. "A break. Now the preparation begins." And as the snow fell again on the monastery, a silent truth dawned. Consolidated. The first time he held the axe was to survive. Next time, it will be to decide who lives. And when the first royal blood touches the blade, he will still be Einar, or something that even he won't recognize. If you made it this far, comment. Do you believe that Einar is becoming inevitable? Or are you heading towards something that could destroy you from within? Because in the next episode, training meets reality. And reality does not forgive hesitation.